I discovered the chronicles in the deepest archives of Macragge, sealed away in crystalline storage matrices that had somehow survived 10 millennia of war and upheaval. They were written by those who had known Roboute Guilliman before he became legend. Servants, soldiers, scholars, and citizens who had witnessed the transformation of a foundling child into the Avenging Son of the Emperor. Their words, preserved in the patient script of archivists and the hasty scrawl of battlefield correspondence, painted a portrait not of a distant demigod, but of a man driven by an unshakable conviction that order could triumph over chaos. The first voice belonged to Tarasha Uten, the woman who had served as Guilliman's surrogate mother and confidant throughout his formative years. Her memories, dictated in her final days, spoke of a child whose greatest gift was not his superhuman strength or intellect, but his capacity to see patterns where others saw only confusion. He was never content with things as they were. Her voice whispered across the centuries. From his earliest days, Roboute would observe our household's routines and suggest improvements, not from arrogance or impatience, but from a genuine desire to understand why we did things one way rather than another. When he was barely tall enough to reach my writing desk, he reorganized my correspondence files according to a system that made such perfect sense I adopted it immediately and used it for the rest of my life. As I read these testimonies by candlelight in my study overlooking the restored gardens of Macragge's capital, I began to understand that Guilliman's rise was not the story of conquest through force, but of transformation through example. His greatest victories were not won on battlefields, but in council chambers, not through the destruction of enemies, but through the elevation of allies. What follows is their story, the account of how a lost son of the emperor became not just a warrior, but a builder, not just a leader, but a teacher, showing the galaxy what humanity might become when guided by wisdom rather than driven by ambition. Chapter 1. The Child of Two Fathers. The account that opens this collection comes from Conor Galan, the consul of Macragge, who discovered the infant Primarch and chose to raise him as his own son. His private journals, written in the careful script of a lifelong administrator, reveal the wonder and trepidation of a mortal man entrusted with nurturing a demigod. The child fell from the sky on the eve of the festival of founding, Conor wrote, his words still carrying the awe of that distant night. A streak of golden fire that burned across the heavens before striking the mountainside with force enough to shake our city's foundations. When my scouts reached the impact site, they found not destruction, but creation. A crater lined with crystalline growths that seemed to pulse with inner light, and at its center, an infant whose eyes held the wisdom of ages. The decision to adopt the mysterious child was not made lightly. Macragge was a world beset by challenges, civil strife, economic instability, and the constant threat of raids from the barbarian Illyrians who dwelt in the northern mountains. Many of Conor's advisors counseled caution, fearing that the child might be some trick of their enemies or a curse sent by vengeful gods. Yet, when I held him in my arms, Conor recorded, I felt only overwhelming certainty that this child was meant to be here, meant to be mine to guide and protect. He looked at me with such profound intelligence that I found myself speaking to him as I would to an adult, explaining our customs and concerns as though he could understand every word. Perhaps he could. The early years of Guilliman's life on Macragge were marked by an almost supernatural rate of development. By his 5th birthday, he had mastered reading and writing in 3 languages, demonstrated an intuitive understanding of mathematics that impressed the city's scholars, and begun to display the physical capabilities that marked him as something beyond human. His tutors came to me weekly with reports that bordered on the incredible, Conor noted. Young Roboute would complete lessons intended for students twice his age, then ask questions that revealed he had already begun thinking beyond the material presented. When presented with historical accounts of past conflicts, he would analyze them not just for what happened, but for what should have happened differently, offering tactical assessments that seasoned commanders found difficult to refute. The relationship between father and son deepened as Guilliman's extraordinary nature became increasingly apparent. Rather than being intimidated by his adopted child's capabilities, Conor embraced his role as guide and mentor, helping the young Primarch understand not just what power could accomplish, but how it should be wielded. "I taught him that strength without wisdom is mere brutality," Conor wrote, "that leadership without compassion becomes tyranny, and that victory without honor is indistinguishable from defeat." He absorbed these lessons with the same intensity he brought to everything else, asking probing questions that often forced me to examine my own beliefs more carefully than I ever had before. The first public demonstration of Guilliman's unique gifts came during his 10th year, when raiders from the Illyrian tribes struck at one of Macragge's outlying settlements. The attack had been carefully planned to occur during the Harvest Festival, when most of the settlement's defenders would be celebrating rather than maintaining vigilance. "The news reached us at dawn," Conor recorded. "My military advisors estimated it would take 2 days to organize a relief force capable of driving off the raiders." Roboute listened to their deliberations in silence, then quietly excused himself from the council chamber. I found him an hour later in my study, bent over maps of the region with a look of absolute concentration. What followed was Guilliman's first military campaign, though he was barely old enough to wear armor. Working with a small force of volunteers, he had devised a strategy that used the raiders' own tactics against them, turning their planned retreat into a carefully orchestrated trap. The boy, for he was still a boy, despite everything, led the charge himself, Conor wrote with obvious pride and worry. "I watched from the command post as he moved through the battlefield like a figure from legend, his presence inspiring our soldiers to acts of courage that surprised even themselves. But it was not his physical prowess that won the day so much as his planning. Every movement had been calculated, every contingency prepared for. The raiders were not just defeated, but utterly routed. Their threat to our people ended permanently." The aftermath of this victory revealed another aspect of Guilliman's character that would define his later career. Rather than celebrating his triumph or demanding recognition, he insisted on personally visiting every wounded soldier, citizen, and even captured raider to ensure they received proper care. He spent 3 days in the settlement, helping with the reconstruction efforts and interviewing survivors about the attack, Conor noted. But most of his time was devoted to understanding what had made the settlement vulnerable in the first place. By the time we returned to the capital, he had developed a comprehensive set of recommendations for improving our defensive networks throughout the realm. The implementation of these recommendations marked the beginning of Guilliman's transformation from gifted child to practical reformer. His suggestions were not merely theoretical, but grounded in careful observation of how real people lived and worked under the existing system. He approached governance like a puzzle to be solved rather than a game to be won, Conor reflected. Every policy change was evaluated not just for its immediate effects, but for how it would interact with other aspects of our society. He seemed to understand instinctively that true reform required patience and careful coordination, that lasting change came through evolution rather than revolution. The relationship between the two was tested during Guilliman's 15th year, when political rivals of Conor's administration began spreading rumors about the young man's true nature. Some claimed he was a mutant whose presence brought bad luck. Others whispered that he was a weapon created by their enemies to infiltrate and destroy Macragge from within. The attacks were politically motivated, but personally painful, Conor admitted. I had always known that Roboute's origins would eventually become a source of controversy, but I'd hoped we would have more time to establish his worth through deeds rather than bloodline. When they demanded he be exiled or executed as a threat to our world's purity, I prepared to defend him with my life if necessary. Guilliman's response to these attacks revealed the depth of his political understanding even at such a young age. Rather than allowing his adopted father to fight his battles for him, he requested permission to address the Macragge Senate directly, speaking in his own defense before the assembled representatives of the realm. His speech lasted 3 hours, Conor recorded with obvious admiration. He spoke not of his own achievements, but of his love for Macragge and its people, his gratitude for the opportunities he had been given, and his desire to serve the world that had become his home. When he finished, even his harshest critics were silent. The vote to confirm his place in our society was unanimous. Conor's final observations about this period carry the weight of a man who understood he was witness to something unprecedented. I adopted a foundling and raised a son, but somewhere in those years, Roboute had transformed into something greater than either. He was becoming a leader whose influence would extend far beyond our small world, a figure who would reshape the galaxy itself. My role was changing from father to first follower, and I embraced that transition with pride rather than regret. The galaxy would come to know Roboute Guilliman as a Primarch, a gene-crafted son of the Emperor. But he would always be, first and foremost, a child of Macragge, shaped by our values, devoted to our principles, and committed to proving that order and justice could triumph over chaos and oppression. Chapter 2. The Art of Governance. The testament that follows was written by Sulla Domachus, Chief Administrator of Macragge's Civil Service, whose detailed records provide insight into how Guilliman's theoretical understanding of governance evolved into practical mastery of statecraft. Her observations span the crucial years when the young Primarch transformed from promising student to capable ruler. Lord Guilliman's first official position was Assistant Coordinator of Agricultural Distribution. Domachus recorded, with the precise attention to detail that had made her invaluable to 3 generations of Macragge's leadership. I assigned him this role not because it was particularly important, but because I thought it would be educational for someone of his evident intelligence to understand how our most basic systems actually functioned. I expected him to spend a few months learning proper procedures before moving on to more prestigious assignments. The agricultural distribution network was, in many ways, the foundation of Macragge's stability. The world's fertile valleys produced abundant crops, but the system for getting food from farms to cities had evolved over centuries into a complex web of regulations, traditions, and competing interests that satisfied no one completely. Within a week, Lord Guilliman had identified 17 separate inefficiencies in our current procedures, Domachus noted with obvious admiration. But rather than simply proposing changes, he spent the next month visiting every depot, interviewing every transport coordinator, and personally observing cargo transfers at different times of day and seasons of the year. Only then did he present his recommendations, accompanied by detailed projections of their likely effects. Guilliman's approach to reform was characterized by what Domachus described as methodical comprehensiveness. Rather than making piecemeal adjustments, he sought to understand entire systems and their interconnections before proposing modifications that would improve overall efficiency without disrupting essential functions. His first major success was the implementation of the rotating schedule protocol, Domachus recorded. By staggering delivery times and routes according to seasonal demand patterns, We reduced transportation costs by 15% while actually improving service to outlying communities. But what impressed me most was how he had consulted with everyone affected by the changes before implementing them, ensuring that theoretical improvements would work in practical application. The success of his agricultural reforms led to Guilliman being assigned increasingly complex challenges. Each promotion revealed new aspects of his analytical capabilities and his growing understanding of how different governmental functions interconnected. When he became Deputy Minister of Infrastructure Development, I expected him to focus on engineering concerns, road construction, aqueduct maintenance, the technical aspects of keeping our cities functional, Domacus observed. Instead, he spent equal time studying the social and economic implications of our infrastructure choices. He understood that a new road was not just a means of transportation, but a catalyst for demographic and commercial changes that would ripple through our society for generations. The philosophy that guided Guilliman's administrative work was summarized in what became known as the Macragge Principles, a set of guidelines he developed for evaluating policy proposals and governmental decisions. These principles would later influence the structure of the Codex Astartes, but they originated in his work as a civil administrator. The first principle was comprehensiveness. Any proposed change had to be evaluated for its effects on all aspects of society, not just its intended target, Domacus explained. The second was sustainability. Solutions that solved immediate problems while creating future complications were inherently flawed. The third was adaptability. Systems that could not evolve in response to changing circumstances were destined to become obsolete. Guilliman's most significant early achievement as an administrator was the restructuring of Macragge's tax collection system. The existing approach was a patchwork of levies and fees that had accumulated over centuries, creating a bureaucratic maze that frustrated citizens and officials alike while failing to generate adequate revenue for essential services. He spent 6 months studying our tax codes, not just the current regulations, but their historical development and the reasons behind each modification, Domacus recorded. Then he locked himself in his study for 2 weeks, emerging with a completely redesigned system that was both simpler to understand and more effective at revenue generation. The new tax structure was based on clear, consistent principles rather than accumulated precedent. Citizens knew exactly what they owed and why, while administrators could focus on collection rather than interpretation. The psychological impact was as significant as the practical benefits. For the first time in living memory, our people felt that their government was working for them rather than against them, Domacus noted. Tax compliance actually increased even though we had simplified the process of collection. Citizens who had previously viewed taxation as legalized theft began to see it as investment in their community's future. The success of these domestic reforms established Guilliman's reputation as an administrator of exceptional capability, but it also revealed his growing awareness of threats beyond Macragge's borders. His analysis of trade patterns and resource flows had identified vulnerabilities that could be exploited by hostile forces. He came to me with concerns about our dependency on imported metals from the Illyrian territories, Domacus recorded. His projections showed that a coordinated campaign to disrupt our supply lines could cripple our manufacturing capacity within months. When I asked him what he proposed to do about it, he smiled in a way that made me think his real career was just beginning. The transition from civil administrator to military commander was not as dramatic as might be expected. Guilliman approached warfare with the same methodical thoroughness he had brought to agricultural distribution and tax collection, viewing military campaigns as complex logistical exercises requiring careful coordination of multiple variables. His first independent command was a police action against bandits operating in our southern provinces, Domacus noted. I expected a quick, decisive victory, followed by his return to administrative duties. Instead, he spent 3 months in the field, not just hunting the criminals, but investigating the social conditions that had produced them in the first place. The campaign against the Southern bandits became a template for Guilliman's approach to military problems. Rather than simply applying force to eliminate immediate threats, he sought to address underlying causes that could produce similar problems in the future. When he returned, he brought not just the captured bandit leaders but a comprehensive plan for economic development that would provide legitimate opportunities for the region's young people, Domacus recorded. The military victory was complete, but the social victory was what prevented the problem from recurring. Domacus's final observations about this period reveal her understanding that she had witnessed something unprecedented. Lord Guilliman had demonstrated that administration and leadership were not separate skills, but different aspects of the same fundamental capability. His success came not from choosing between military might and civil governance, but from understanding how they complemented each other. He was preparing himself, and all of us, for challenges that would require every tool at our disposal. Chapter 3. The Forge of Character. The memories that follow come from Master-at-Arms Theron Caius, the weathered veteran who served as Guilliman's primary military instructor during his formative years. His account, dictated to scribes during his final years, reveals how a superhuman child learned to become not just a warrior, but a leader of warriors. The boy's physical capabilities were beyond question from our first training session, Caius recorded, his voice still carrying the authority of a lifetime spent teaching the arts of war. At age 12, he could wield weapons that would challenge grown men, move with speed that made my veteran instructors look clumsy, and demonstrate strength that bordered on the miraculous. Yet it was not his superhuman gifts that impressed me most. It was his hunger to understand the principles behind every technique. The martial training of a Primarch required innovations in both methodology and equipment. Traditional weapons and armor were inadequate for someone of Guilliman's size and strength, while conventional tactics needed modification to account for his unique capabilities. We commissioned the finest smiths on Macragge to craft training equipment suited to his needs, Caius noted. Practice swords forged from the hardest alloys, armor that could withstand impacts that would pulverize normal metal. Training dummies reinforced with internal frameworks that could survive his strikes. Yet even with these preparations, we found ourselves constantly repairing or replacing equipment that simply could not endure the forces he generated. Guilliman's approach to martial training reflected the same methodical thoroughness he brought to every other endeavor. Rather than simply mastering techniques through repetition, he sought to understand the tactical and strategic principles that made them effective. He would practice a sword form until he had achieved technical perfection, then spend hours analyzing why that particular sequence of movements was superior to alternatives, Caius observed. He studied historical accounts of famous duels, not to learn specific techniques, but to understand how different fighting styles reflected different philosophical approaches to conflict resolution. The young Primarch's intellectual curiosity extended beyond individual combat to encompass every aspect of military science. He devoured treatises on logistics, engineering, and psychology with the same intensity he brought to weapons training, gradually developing a comprehensive understanding of warfare as a complex system rather than a simple contest of strength. I remember finding him in the armory late one evening, surrounded by disassembled equipment and technical manuals, Caius recorded. He had taken apart 3 different bolt pistol patterns to understand how their internal mechanisms affected their performance characteristics. When I asked him why this mattered for someone who preferred close combat, He replied that a leader who did not understand his tools could not effectively employ those who wielded them. The first true test of Guilliman's martial skills came during the siege of Laponia, when Illyrian raiders had captured a mountain fortress that controlled a crucial pass through the northern ranges. The stronghold was considered impregnable by conventional assault, having withstood 3 previous attempts at recapture. Lord Guilliman requested permission to lead a small force in an attempt to retake the fortress, Caius noted. His father, Consul Conor, was reluctant to risk his adopted son in such a dangerous enterprise, but the boy presented a tactical analysis that was impossible to refute. He had identified weaknesses in the fortress's design that previous commanders had overlooked. The assault on Laponia demonstrated Guilliman's emerging mastery of combined arms tactics. Rather than relying on his personal prowess to achieve victory, he orchestrated a complex operation that utilized each element of his force according to its specific capabilities. He positioned our archers to provide covering fire while engineers prepared breaching charges at carefully selected points in the fortress walls, Caius recorded. Meanwhile, he led a diversionary assault against the main gate that drew the defenders' attention away from the real threats. When the charges detonated, his forces were already in position to exploit the breaches before the enemy could recover. The victory at Laponia established Guilliman's reputation as a military commander, but more importantly, it revealed his understanding of warfare as an extension of governance rather than an alternative to it. His treatment of captured enemies and liberated territories reflected principles that would later define his approach to galactic conquest. Instead of executing the captured raiders or selling them into slavery, Lord Guilliman offered them a choice, Caius observed. They could face trial for their crimes and accept whatever punishment our courts decreed, or they could swear oaths of allegiance to Macragge and earn redemption through service. Most chose service, and many became some of our most loyal soldiers. The integration of former enemies into Macragge's military forces required innovations in training and organization that reflected Guilliman's evolving understanding of leadership psychology. He recognized that loyalty could not be commanded, but had to be earned through demonstration of worthy purpose. He established what he called redemption companies, units composed entirely of former enemies who were given opportunities to prove their commitment to our cause, Caius recorded. These companies were assigned the most dangerous missions, not as punishment but as chances to demonstrate their worth. Their success rate was remarkable, largely because they understood that failure would mean not just death, but dishonor. The success of the redemption companies led to broader reforms in how Macragge's military forces were organized and motivated. Guilliman introduced merit-based promotion systems, comprehensive training programs, and support structures that treated soldiers as valuable assets rather than expendable resources. He understood that an army's effectiveness depended not just on individual skill but on collective cohesion, Caius noted. He spent as much time developing systems for communication and coordination as he did on weapons training. His companies operated with a unity of purpose that made them far more effective than their numbers would suggest. The philosophical foundation underlying Guilliman's military reforms was his belief that warfare should serve constructive rather than destructive purposes. Victory was meaningless unless it contributed to long-term stability and prosperity for all parties involved. I once asked him why he invested so much effort in treating enemies with honor when it would be simpler to eliminate them entirely, Caius recorded. His response has stayed with me across all the years since. Every enemy we destroy represents a failure to achieve our objectives through better means. Every enemy we convert becomes a resource for achieving greater goals. The highest form of victory is not the defeat of opposition, but the transformation of opponents into allies. The final lesson that Caius sought to convey through his memoirs was his recognition that Guilliman's martial training had been merely preparation for responsibilities that transcended traditional concepts of warfare. I taught him to fight, but he learned to lead, Caius concluded. I showed him how to defeat enemies, but he discovered how to create friends. The boy who came to me, seeking to master the arts of war, became a man who understood that the highest art was making war unnecessary. When he finally left Macragge to reunite with his true father, I knew that the galaxy would never be the same. Chapter 4. The Unification of Purpose. The account that follows was written by Senator Cassia Orlandria, one of the few voices of opposition in the Macragge Senate who eventually became one of Guilliman's most trusted advisors. Her transformation from critic to supporter provides unique insight into how the young Primarch learned to build consensus, even among those who initially disagreed with his methods. I opposed his appointment as deputy consul from the moment it was announced, Orlandria wrote, with the unflinching honesty that had made her a formidable political opponent. Not because I questioned his capabilities. Even his harshest critics acknowledged his exceptional gifts, but because I feared that elevating someone so young to such high office would set dangerous precedents for our republic's future. The political climate on Macragge during Guilliman's rise was characterized by careful balance between competing factions and interests. The world's prosperity had been built on compromise and gradual change, values that seemed threatened by the revolutionary potential of a leader, whose very existence challenged conventional assumptions about human limitations. He was barely 20 years old when Consul Conor proposed making him heir to the leadership of our realm, Orlandria recorded. I led the faction that argued for traditional succession procedures, insisting that merit alone was insufficient qualification for supreme authority. Experience, wisdom, and demonstrated commitment to our constitutional principles were equally important. The debate over Guilliman's political future lasted for months, with passionate arguments on both sides about the nature of leadership and the proper relationship between exceptional individuals and republican institutions. Orlandria found herself forced to articulate principles that had previously been taken for granted. Young Lord Guilliman attended every session of these debates, listening intently but rarely speaking, she noted. When he did contribute to the discussions, his questions were always precisely targeted at the weakest points in our arguments. He never attacked our conclusions directly, but he forced us to examine the assumptions that supported them. The turning point in Orlandria's opposition came during a particularly contentious session where she had challenged Guilliman's understanding of constitutional law. Rather than defending himself, he requested permission to address her concerns through a detailed analysis of their governmental system's historical development. He spoke for 2 hours without notes, tracing the evolution of our Constitution from its origins as a collection of tribal customs to its current form as a sophisticated framework for republican governance, Orlandria recorded with obvious admiration. But what impressed me was not his knowledge of legal precedent, impressive though it was, but his understanding of the principles that had guided each constitutional modification. Guilliman's presentation revealed that he viewed their political system not as a fixed structure, but as a living organism that had evolved in response to changing circumstances. His proposed reforms were not departures from tradition but natural developments that honored the system's fundamental values while addressing new challenges. He demonstrated that our Constitution had always adapted to accommodate exceptional circumstances and extraordinary individuals, Orlandria noted. Previous amendments had created frameworks for emergency leadership, wartime governance, and crisis management. His elevation to deputy consul was not a violation of our principles, but their logical application to unprecedented conditions. The debate over constitutional precedent gradually transformed into broader discussions about the nature of governance, and the relationship between individual excellence and collective welfare. Orlandria found herself engaged in philosophical conversations that challenged her fundamental assumptions about political authority. He asked me whether our republic existed to serve its citizens or to preserve its institutions, she recorded. When I replied that both objectives were equally important, he pressed me to consider what should happen when those objectives came into conflict. His questions forced me to think more deeply about my political beliefs than I had in decades of public service. The resolution of the succession debate came not through political maneuvering, but through demonstration of practical competence. Guilliman requested assignment to a series of increasingly challenging administrative roles, proving his capabilities through measurable achievements rather than rhetorical arguments. Within 6 months, he had reorganized our tax collection system, streamlined our judicial procedures, and implemented infrastructure improvements that had been debated for years without resolution, Orlandria observed. More importantly, he had accomplished these reforms while maintaining support from all major political factions, a feat that I had considered impossible. The methods Guilliman used to build political consensus reflected his deep understanding of human psychology and group dynamics. Rather than imposing his will through authority or charisma, he created frameworks that allowed others to reach conclusions that supported his objectives. He would present problems rather than solutions, allowing senators to develop their own approaches to addressing challenges, Orlandria noted. When multiple senators proposed different solutions, he would facilitate discussions that revealed the strengths and weaknesses of each approach. Somehow, these discussions always concluded with unanimous support for courses of action that closely resembled his original intentions. The political skills that Guilliman developed during this period would later prove crucial to his success as a military commander and imperial administrator. His ability to inspire voluntary cooperation made his forces far more effective than simple command authority could have achieved. I watched him transform our fractious Senate into a unified governing body, Orlandria recorded. Senators who had spent decades opposing each other found themselves working together toward common goals. The secret was not that he eliminated disagreement, but that he channeled it into productive debate about methods rather than destructive conflict about objectives. The final test of Guilliman's political leadership came during the crisis that would ultimately lead to his departure from Macragge. Reports had reached them of strange ships in the outer system, vessels unlike anything in their experience that seemed to be conducting some form of reconnaissance. The Senate was divided about how to respond to these mysterious visitors, Orlandria noted. Some advocated immediate military action, others counseled diplomatic contact, and still others recommended hiding until the strangers departed. Lord Guilliman listened to all perspectives before proposing an approach that incorporated elements from each faction's concerns. Guilliman's response to the arrival of the Emperor's expedition fleet demonstrated his mastery of both political and military leadership. He organized Macragge's defenses while simultaneously preparing for peaceful contact, ensuring that their world would be ready for either conflict or cooperation. When the strangers finally revealed themselves as representatives of something called the Imperium of Man, Lord Guilliman was ready, Orlandria recorded. He had prepared our people for the possibility that we were not alone in the galaxy, and he had positioned our world to benefit from contact with a larger civilization rather than being overwhelmed by it. Orlandria's final observations about Guilliman's time on Macragge reflect her understanding that she had witnessed the development of leadership skills that transcended normal human capabilities. He taught us that true authority comes not from the power to command obedience, but from the ability to inspire voluntary cooperation. His greatest achievement was not any specific reform or victory, but the transformation of how we understood the relationship between leaders and led. When he left to join his true father among the stars, we remained united, not because we feared his absence, but because we had learned to govern ourselves according to the principles he had demonstrated. That, perhaps, was the greatest gift any leader could give to those he served. Chapter 5. The Moment of Recognition. The testimony that follows comes from Captain General Valdris Aron of the 65th Expeditionary Fleet, whose detailed logs provide the only comprehensive Imperial account of first contact with Roboute Guilliman and the world of Macragge. His observations reveal both the Emperor's anticipation of this reunion and the profound impact of discovering one of his sons already governing a thriving civilization. We translated into the Macragge system on the 127th day of the year, following augur readings that had led us to believe we might find traces of advanced human civilization. Aron recorded in the precise language of military documentation. What we discovered exceeded our most optimistic projections. The planet showed clear signs of organized development. Regular energy signatures, structured orbital traffic, and communication broadcasts that indicated not just survival but genuine prosperity. The approach to Macragge had been planned with unusual care, reflecting the Emperor's growing certainty that this world harbored one of his lost sons. Unlike typical compliance actions that emphasized overwhelming display of imperial might, the expedition was configured for diplomacy as much as conquest. His Majesty personally reviewed our contact protocols, Aron noted. Standard imperial doctrine called for immediate demonstration of superior force to discourage resistance from primitive populations. Instead, we were ordered to maintain defensive postures while broadcasting messages of peaceful intent. When questioned about these unusual procedures, the Emperor replied that we were not conquering a world, but reuniting with family. The response from Macragge surprised even veterans who had participated in dozens of first contact scenarios. Rather than the confusion or panic that typically characterized primitive worlds' reactions to imperial fleets, their communications were coherent, organized, and diplomatically sophisticated. The planetary government requested a formal parley under what they termed Protocols of Civilized Contact, Aron recorded. They proposed a meeting between representatives of equal authority at a neutral location of mutual agreement. Such diplomatic sophistication was unprecedented among worlds that had been isolated since the Age of Strife. The individual who emerged as Macragge's primary representative exceeded all expectations. Even before his identity was confirmed, it was clear that they were dealing with someone whose capabilities transcended normal human limitations. Lord Guilliman, though we did not yet know his name, arrived aboard a craft that demonstrated technological sophistication approaching imperial standards, Aron noted. His personal presence was immediately apparent to every individual in the meeting chamber. This was clearly someone accustomed to command, someone whose authority derived from demonstrated competence rather than inherited position. The formal introduction between the Emperor and his lost son was conducted with ceremonial dignity that honored both imperial protocol and Macragge's republican traditions. Yet beneath the diplomatic formalities, witnesses reported an undercurrent of profound emotion that transcended mere political alliance. When His Majesty revealed Lord Guilliman's true parentage, the young man's response was not surprise but recognition, Aron observed. He had known somehow that this moment would come. His questions were not about his origins but about his responsibilities, what was expected of him, how he could serve the greater cause that his father represented. The integration of Macragge into the Imperium proceeded with unprecedented smoothness. Rather than the typical pattern of conquest followed by gradual assimilation, Guilliman's world became a model for how advanced human civilizations could contribute to imperial expansion. Lord Guilliman insisted that his people be given opportunities to demonstrate their value to the Imperium rather than simply accepting absorption, Aaron recorded. Within weeks, Macragge's administrative systems were being studied by imperial bureaucrats as examples of efficient governance. Their military forces were conducting joint exercises with Astartes companies, proving themselves worthy allies rather than mere subjects. The discovery of the 13th Legion's gene seed compatibility with their Primarch marked the beginning of Guilliman's transformation from planetary ruler to galactic commander. Yet, this transition was managed with characteristic attention to maintaining continuity, rather than replacing existing structures. The integration of Terran and Macragge personnel within the 13th Legion proceeded according to protocols that Lord Guilliman developed specifically for this purpose, Aaron noted. Rather than imposing Terran traditions on Macragge recruits or vice versa, he created hybrid systems that incorporated the best elements from both cultures. The Emperor's personal involvement in Guilliman's orientation to imperial service was more intensive than had been typical for other Primarchs. Private meetings between father and son extended for hours, covering not just military doctrine, but political philosophy and long-term strategic planning. His Majesty spent considerable time explaining the theoretical foundations of the imperial truth and the practical challenges of governing a galaxy-spanning civilization, Aaron recorded. Lord Guilliman's questions revealed that he had already begun thinking about these issues from his experience governing Macragge. The conversations were less instruction than collaboration between minds that operated on similar levels of complexity. The first joint military operation involving Guilliman and his newly integrated legion was planned as much for educational purposes as strategic necessity. The target was a system whose human population had fallen under the influence of Xenos manipulators, requiring precisely the kind of combined military and diplomatic approach that suited the 13th Legion's emerging character. The cleansing of Thessa demonstrated Lord Guilliman's unique approach to compliance operations, Aaron observed. Rather than the overwhelming assault typical of Astartes campaigns, he orchestrated a careful campaign that separated hostile Xenos from their human collaborators, offering redemption to those who had been coerced into cooperation. The success of the Thessa operation established patterns that would define Guilliman's contribution to the Great Crusade. His forces became specialists in complex operations that required political sophistication as much as military might. Campaigns where the objective was integration rather than simple conquest. Lord Guilliman's post-operation reports were unlike anything in our archives, Aaron noted. He documented not just tactical successes but administrative procedures for incorporating liberated populations into imperial governance. Each campaign became a case study in effective expansion rather than simple territorial acquisition. The relationship between Guilliman and his brother Primarchs began to develop during this period, as various Legion commanders encountered the 13th Legion during joint operations. The reactions revealed the diversity of approaches that different Primarchs brought to their shared mission. Legion Master Marius of the 7th Legion expressed admiration for Lord Guilliman's systematic approach to warfare, Aaron recorded. However, he noted that such methodical preparation might prove too slow for certain types of campaign. Lord Guilliman's response was characteristically thoughtful. He acknowledged the validity of different approaches while maintaining confidence in his own methods. The emergence of philosophical differences between Primarchs was already apparent during these early encounters. Guilliman's emphasis on building sustainable institutions sometimes conflicted with other legions' focus on rapid expansion or total victory. A heated discussion occurred between Lord Guilliman and representatives of the 8th Legion regarding the treatment of conquered populations, Aaron noted. The Night Lords advocated fear-based compliance that would discourage future resistance. Lord Guilliman argued that such methods created unstable conditions requiring constant military presence to maintain order. The Emperor's response to these developing differences revealed his understanding that diversity of approach among his sons could be an asset rather than a liability. Each Primarch was being shaped by their experiences to fill different roles in the vast enterprise of the galactic conquest. His Majesty observed that the galaxy's diverse challenges required diverse solutions, Aaron recorded. Lord Guilliman's methods were ideally suited for incorporating advanced civilizations and establishing stable governance. Other Primarchs excelled at different aspects of the campaign. The key was ensuring that each son's capabilities were deployed where they could be most effective. The first major independent command assigned to Guilliman involved the pacification of the Ultramar sector, a region whose scattered human colonies had maintained intermittent contact despite isolation since the Age of Strife. The assignment was perfectly suited to his combination of military and administrative capabilities. The Ultramar campaign represented Lord Guilliman's opportunity to demonstrate his vision for imperial expansion on a grand scale, Aaron observed. Rather than conquering individual worlds separately, he developed a comprehensive strategy for integrating the entire region into a coherent administrative unit. The success of the Ultramar integration exceeded all expectations, and established Guilliman as one of the Emperor's most trusted sons. Within a decade, the region had been transformed from a collection of struggling colonies into a prosperous sector that contributed significantly to the Great Crusade's expansion. Lord Guilliman's achievement in Ultramar became a template for efficient imperial expansion, Aaron noted. His methods were studied by other Legion commanders and imperial administrators throughout the galaxy. He had proven that conquest could be both rapid and sustainable when properly planned and executed. Aaron's final observations about this period reflect his understanding that he had witnessed something unprecedented in military history. Lord Guilliman had demonstrated that the highest form of generalship was not the ability to win battles, but the capacity to create lasting peace. His campaigns were measured not just by territories conquered but by civilizations elevated, not just by enemies defeated, but by allies gained. When other commanders spoke of victory, they meant the defeat of opposition. When Lord Guilliman spoke of victory, he meant the creation of order from chaos, the transformation of conflict into cooperation. That distinction would define his contribution to the Great Crusade and, ultimately, to the survival of humanity itself. Chapter 6. The Builder of Legions. The account that follows comes from 1st Captain Marius Gage of the 13th Legion, whose intimate knowledge of the Ultramarines' transformation under their Primarch's leadership provides crucial insight into how Guilliman rebuilt his forces according to principles that transcended conventional military doctrine. The legion that Lord Guilliman inherited was competent but unremarkable, Gage recorded with the candid assessment of a warrior who had served before and after the reunion. We were disciplined, well-trained, and absolutely loyal to the Emperor, but we lacked the distinctive character that marked the greatest legions. We were tools waiting for a craftsman skilled enough to realize our potential. The integration of Terran and Macragge traditions within the 13th Legion required innovations in organization and culture that reflected Guilliman's deep understanding of human psychology. Rather than imposing a single model, he created frameworks that allowed the best elements of both cultures to flourish. Lord Guilliman spent months interviewing every captain and sergeant in the Legion, Gage noted, not to evaluate our loyalty, that was never in question, but to understand our experiences, our perspectives, and our ideas about how warfare should be conducted. He was building not just a military force, but a community of warriors united by shared purpose. The philosophical foundation of the reformed 13th Legion was crystallized in what became known as the theoretical practical, a comprehensive doctrine that addressed every aspect of military service from individual combat techniques to strategic planning. Unlike the rigid codes that governed some legions, the theoretical practical emphasized adaptability and continuous improvement. Lord Guilliman taught us that doctrine should guide thinking rather than replace it, Gage observed. Every principle in the theoretical practical was accompanied by explanations of its underlying logic and examples of circumstances where modifications might be necessary. We were encouraged to think rather than simply obey. The training regimens that Guilliman implemented for his legion combined physical conditioning with intellectual development in ways that reflected his belief that modern warfare required warriors who could think as well as fight. Every Ultramarine was expected to master multiple specializations rather than focusing narrowly on single skills. Chapter Master Gorod once asked Lord Guilliman why he insisted that assault specialists learn logistics and why tactical Marines trained in diplomacy, Gage recorded. His response became legendary within the Legion. A warrior who understands only warfare understands nothing. Victory requires mastery of every aspect of human endeavor, from the technical details of weapon maintenance to the subtle arts of persuasion and governance. The organizational structure that Guilliman developed for the 13th Legion reflected his conviction that military effectiveness depended on clear communication and efficient coordination. The famous company structure, with its precise delineation of roles and responsibilities, allowed for unprecedented flexibility in campaign planning. Each company could operate independently when circumstances required, but they were designed to work together with seamless efficiency, Gage explained. Lord Guilliman had created a military instrument that could adapt to any challenge while maintaining coherent command structure and shared objectives. The first major campaign conducted by the reformed 13th Legion was the compliance of the Gaunt Worlds, a cluster of systems whose human populations had developed unique cultures during their isolation. The operation became a showcase for Guilliman's revolutionary approach to military expansion. Rather than the typical pattern of overwhelming assault followed by administrative occupation, Lord Guilliman deployed what he called graduated integration, Gage recorded. Each world was approached according to its specific circumstances, with force levels and diplomatic protocols calibrated to achieve compliance with minimum destruction of existing infrastructure. The success of the Gaunt Worlds campaign established the 13th Legion's reputation for efficiency and effectiveness that attracted the attention of the Emperor himself. More importantly, it demonstrated that Guilliman's methods could achieve strategic objectives more quickly and completely than traditional approaches. Lord Commander Eidolon of the Emperor's Children observed our operations and commented that we achieved in months what might have taken other legions years, Gage noted. But Lord Guilliman's satisfaction came not from the speed of our victory, but from the fact that the Gaunt Worlds immediately began contributing to Imperial expansion rather than requiring years of reconstruction. The development of what would later become the Codex Astartes began during this period, as Guilliman systematically documented the lessons learned from each campaign. Rather than simply recording tactical successes, he analyzed the principles that made certain approaches more effective than others. Every battle was followed by detailed analysis sessions where Lord Guilliman encouraged frank discussion of what had worked and what could be improved, Gage recorded. These sessions were not mere critiques, but collaborative efforts to understand warfare at its deepest levels. The insights gained became the foundation for doctrine that would guide not just our Legion, but the entire Astartes. The relationship between Guilliman and his warriors was characterized by mutual respect rather than simple hierarchy. While his authority was absolute, he exercised it in ways that encouraged initiative and personal development among his subordinates. Lord Guilliman once told me that a leader's greatest achievement was making himself unnecessary, Gage observed. He trained us to think strategically, to understand the broader context of our missions, and to make decisions that served Imperial objectives even when separated from direct command oversight. We became not just his tools, but his partners in the great work of conquest. The expansion of the 13th Legion's area of operations to encompass the entirety of the Ultramar sector required innovations in command structure and resource management that influenced Imperial military doctrine throughout the galaxy. Guilliman's solutions became templates for other Legion commanders facing similar challenges. Managing campaigns across multiple star systems simultaneously required coordination mechanisms that had never been attempted before, Gage noted. Lord Guilliman developed communication protocols, logistical networks, and strategic planning procedures that enabled a single Legion to effectively govern and defend hundreds of worlds. The cultural transformation of the 13th Legion extended beyond military doctrine to encompass broader concepts of duty and purpose. Guilliman's warriors came to see themselves not just as conquerors, but as builders, not just as destroyers of enemies, but as creators of order. We learned to measure success not just by battles won, but by civilizations elevated, Gage reflected. Lord Guilliman taught us that the highest form of victory was making war unnecessary through the establishment of just and effective governance. We became warriors in service of peace rather than conflict. The legacy of Guilliman's leadership during this period was summarized in Gage's final observations. Lord Guilliman transformed us from a legion into something greater, a brotherhood united by shared understanding of what we were fighting for, rather than simple obedience to orders. We became the instruments of his vision for humanity's future, warriors who understood that our battles were meaningless unless they contributed to the creation of something worth defending. When the time came for us to stand against the darkness that threatened to consume the galaxy, we were ready not just as soldiers but as guardians of everything that made civilization worth preserving. Chapter 7. The Codex Eternal. The testament that follows was written by Librarian-Chief Tigurius during the dark years following the Horus Heresy, as Guilliman labored to create the document that would define the future of the Space Marines. His account reveals both the intellectual magnificence of the Codex Astartes and the personal cost of its creation to the Primarch, who had lost everything he had built. The Primarch began writing the Codex in the ruins of Kolth, Tigurius recorded, his words heavy with the memory of that devastated world. The word-bearer's betrayal had shattered not just our fleet but our faith in the brotherhood that had once united the legions. As Lord Guilliman surveyed the poisoned skies and burning cities where millions of his sons had died, I saw him reach a conclusion that would reshape the galaxy's future. The immediate aftermath of the heresy had left the surviving Loyalist legions scattered and traumatized. The betrayal of nearly half their brother legions had revealed fundamental flaws in the Emperor's original design that demanded systematic analysis and correction. Lord Guilliman spent months interviewing survivors from every engagement, Tigurius noted, not just to understand what had happened, but to identify the patterns that had made such catastrophic betrayal possible. He approached the problem with the same methodical thoroughness he had once brought to governing Macragge, but now his task was preventing the Empire itself from tearing itself apart again. The early drafts of the Codex Astartes were shaped as much by grief as by strategic analysis. Guilliman was not just documenting military doctrine, but processing the emotional trauma of watching his beloved Legion Brotherhood transform into the instrument of galactic civil war. I found him one night in his study, surrounded by tactical manuals and casualty reports, weeping for brothers who had become enemies, Tigurius recorded. When I asked if he needed anything, he replied that he was trying to understand how beings created for nobility could fall so far. The Codex, he said, had to address not just military organization, but the spiritual vulnerabilities that had made corruption possible. The philosophical foundation of the Codex reflected Guilliman's conviction that institutional structure could prevent individual weakness from compromising collective purpose. The division of the legions into smaller chapters was not just a military reform, but a safeguard against the concentration of power that had enabled the heresy. The 1,000-warrior limit was calculated not for tactical efficiency, but for psychological security, Tigurius explained. Lord Guilliman had determined that larger organizations inevitably developed internal hierarchies and loyalty structures that could be exploited by charismatic leaders with corrupted intentions. Smaller chapters would remain focused on external threats rather than internal politics. The creation of the Codex required innovations in documentation and analysis that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with traditional imperial technology. Guilliman employed cogitators, data scribes, and even experimental artificial intelligence to process the vast amount of information required for comprehensive military doctrine. Every battle fought during the Great Crusade was analyzed for tactical lessons, Tigurius noted. Every successful strategy was broken down into component principles that could be adapted to different circumstances. Every failure was examined to understand how similar mistakes could be prevented in the future. The scope of the analysis was unprecedented. The sections of the Codex dealing with organization and tactics were relatively straightforward applications of proven principles. But the portions addressing leadership, morale, and spiritual discipline required Guilliman to grapple with questions that had no clear answers. How do you teach loyalty that cannot be corrupted? Tigurius recorded. How do you create structures that encourage initiative while preventing insubordination? How do you balance flexibility with consistency? Lord Guilliman spent years wrestling with these paradoxes, seeking solutions that honored both practical necessity and moral idealism. The testing phase of the Codex involved implementing proposed reforms within the reformed 13th Legion, using the Ultramarines as a laboratory for doctrinal development. The results were mixed, revealing both the strengths and limitations of Guilliman's theoretical frameworks. Some innovations proved immediately successful, Tigurius observed. The new command structures improved coordination and reduced the risk of communication failures. The standardized training protocols ensured consistent quality across different companies, but other reforms created unexpected problems that required constant adjustment. The resistance to Codex implementation came not from external opponents, but from within the remaining Loyalist legions themselves. Many veterans viewed the proposed changes as betrayal of traditions that had sustained them through the darkest periods of the heresy. Chapter Master Sigismund of the Imperial Fists argued that dividing the legions would weaken humanity's defenses at precisely the moment when unity was most needed, Tigurius recorded. Lord Guilliman's response was patient but firm. Unity that depended on personal loyalty was inherently fragile, while unity based on shared principles could endure any test. The political dimension of Codex implementation required Guilliman to exercise skills that had served him well as a planetary governor, but were less familiar in the context of military reform. He had to build consensus among proud warriors who viewed change as implicit criticism of their past service. Lord Guilliman's approach was to demonstrate rather than argue, Tigurius noted. The reformed Ultramarines' superior performance in post-heresy campaigns gradually convinced skeptics that the Codex principles were practical rather than merely theoretical. Success spoke louder than rhetoric. The completion of the Codex Astartes marked both triumph and tragedy for its author. Guilliman had created a framework that would prevent future betrayals on the scale of the Horus heresy, but at the cost of dismantling the Legion system that had been his life's work. I watched him sign the final authorization for Legion dissolution with hands that trembled slightly, Tigurius recorded. He was destroying something he loved in order to save something he loved more. The sacrifice required moral courage that impressed even those who disagreed with his conclusions. The long-term impact of the Codex would extend far beyond its immediate military applications. By establishing principles for how power should be organized and exercised, Guilliman had created a constitutional framework that would influence imperial governance for millennia. The Codex became more than military doctrine, Tigurius observed. It became a statement of principles about how institutions should serve individuals rather than the reverse, how authority should be exercised responsibly rather than arbitrarily, how loyalty should be earned rather than demanded. Tigurius's final assessment of the Codex and its creator carries the weight of someone who had witnessed both the necessity and the cost of Guilliman's greatest achievement. Lord Guilliman sacrificed his personal happiness for the future security of humanity. He transformed victory in the heresy into victory over the vulnerabilities that had made the heresy possible. The Codex Astartes stands as monument not just to his strategic brilliance but to his moral courage, the willingness to do what was necessary rather than what was comfortable, to choose long-term stability over short-term sentiment. In the grim darkness of our age, perhaps that is the highest form of heroism any leader can achieve. Chapter 8. The Burden of Command. The account that follows comes from Captain Uriel Ventris of the 4th Company, whose service during the final campaigns of the Great Crusade provided him with intimate knowledge of how the accumulated pressures of leadership affected even a Primarch's superhuman constitution. His observations reveal the personal cost of bearing responsibility for both military victory and galactic governance. By the closing years of the Great Crusade, Lord Guilliman carried burdens that would have crushed lesser beings. Ventris recorded, with the concern of a son watching his father age before his eyes. He was simultaneously commanding military campaigns across multiple sectors, administering the governance of Ultramar, contributing to the development of imperial policy, and maintaining diplomatic relationships with his brother Primarchs. The toll was visible to those who knew him well. The expansion of Ultramar into a model sector had created administrative responsibilities that exceeded even Guilliman's exceptional capabilities. Each success generated new challenges as worlds requested integration into his realm, viewing his governance as preferable to standard imperial administration. Requests for Ultramar citizenship arrived daily, Ventris noted. Planetary governors who had witnessed our methods firsthand petitioned for inclusion in Lord Guilliman's domain. While he was gratified by this recognition, each addition to our realm exponentially increased the complexity of his duties. The development of what would become the Codex Astartes had begun during this period, as Guilliman sought to systematize the lessons learned from decades of military campaigns. The intellectual demands of this project were enormous, requiring analysis of countless battles and synthesis of strategic principles that could guide future generations. I often found Lord Guilliman working through the night in his study, surrounded by tactical reports and theoretical treatises, Ventris recorded. He would analyze individual engagements for hours, seeking to understand not just what had happened, but why certain approaches had proved more effective than others. The scope of his research was unprecedented. The The relationships between Primarchs had grown increasingly complex as the Great Crusade neared completion. Philosophical differences that had seemed minor during the expansion phase became more pronounced as questions arose about the Imperium's post-conquest future. Lord Guilliman's meetings with his brothers often lasted for days, Ventress observed. The debates were intellectually intense, but sometimes emotionally fraught, as different visions of humanity's destiny came into conflict. Lord Guilliman advocated for stable institutions and gradual development, while others favored more radical approaches to social transformation. The isolation that came with supreme command was perhaps the heaviest burden Guilliman bore. As one of the Emperor's most trusted sons, he was privy to information and responsibilities that could not be shared with subordinates, no matter how loyal or capable. There were times when I could see the weight of knowledge pressing down on him, Ventress noted. Decisions that affected billions of lives, intelligence about threats that could not be made public, awareness of political undercurrents that might tear the Imperium apart. All of this he carried alone, sharing his concerns only with his father during their rare private meetings. The perfectionist tendencies that had served Guilliman well as a planetary administrator became sources of stress when applied to galactic-scale challenges. Problems that could be solved through careful analysis and systematic implementation on Macragge proved resistant to such approaches when magnified across thousands of worlds. Lord Guilliman would spend weeks developing comprehensive solutions to imperial administrative problems, only to discover that implementation was prevented by political considerations or resource limitations, Ventress recorded. The gap between what he could envision and what he could achieve created frustrations that he struggled to express. The personal relationships that had sustained Guilliman throughout his rise to power became increasingly strained as his responsibilities expanded. Friends and mentors from his youth on Macragge found themselves unable to relate to someone whose concerns encompassed the governance of star systems rather than cities. Tarasha Uton, who had been like a mother to him, confided her worries about his emotional state, Ventress noted. She observed that success had not brought him happiness, but had instead imposed obligations that prevented him from enjoying the achievements he had worked so hard to attain. The military campaigns that Guilliman commanded during this period were marked by tactical brilliance, but also by signs of the strain he was experiencing. His perfectionist approach to planning sometimes delayed operations while he sought optimal solutions to complex problems. The cleansing of the Ghoul stars demonstrated both Lord Guilliman's strategic genius and the costs of his thoroughness, Ventress recorded. His preparation was so comprehensive that victory was assured before the first shot was fired. However, the 3 months of planning could have been reduced to 3 weeks if he had been willing to accept higher casualty projections. The philosophical evolution that Guilliman underwent during this period reflected his growing understanding of the relationship between individual excellence and institutional stability. His early focus on personal achievement gradually gave way to concern for creating systems that could function effectively without his direct oversight. Lord Guilliman began speaking more frequently about legacy and succession, Ventress observed. He worried that the structures he had built depended too heavily on his personal involvement. His efforts to delegate authority and develop capable subordinates reflected his understanding that true leadership required making oneself dispensable. The first signs of the corruption that would eventually tear the galaxy apart were visible to Guilliman long before they became apparent to others. His analytical mind detected patterns in reports from other legions that suggested growing problems with discipline and loyalty. I watched Lord Guilliman study intelligence reports with increasing concern, Ventress recorded. He began requesting additional information about incidents that others dismissed as isolated disciplinary problems. His questions revealed that he was seeing connections that had escaped other observers. The isolation of command was compounded by Guilliman's growing awareness that he might need to take actions that would be unpopular with his brothers and subordinates. The responsibility for preserving the Imperium's future might require choices that would destroy relationships he valued. In his private moments, Lord Guilliman spoke of the loneliness that came with understanding consequences that others could not see, Ventress noted. He carried knowledge about potential futures that would have paralyzed lesser minds with despair. Yet he continued to plan and work and hope, driven by conviction that preparation and vigilance might prevent the worst outcomes. Ventress's final observations about this period capture both the magnificence and the tragedy of leadership at the highest levels. Lord Guilliman had achieved everything he had once dreamed of and more. He commanded legions, governed worlds, and advised the Emperor himself on matters of galactic significance. Yet I never saw him truly happy during those final years of the Great Crusade. Success had not freed him, but had instead bound him more tightly to responsibilities that consumed every moment of his existence. He had become indispensable to the Imperium, but in doing so he had made himself prisoner to its needs. Perhaps that is the ultimate price of greatness. Not just the burden of achievement, but the sacrifice of personal fulfillment to the demands of larger purpose. Chapter 9. The Test of Heresy. The testimony that follows comes from Brother Chaplain Cassius, whose role as spiritual guardian of the 13th Legion placed him uniquely positioned to observe how Guilliman responded to the greatest crisis in Imperial history. His account reveals both the strategic brilliance and the moral anguish of a Primarch forced to fight his own brothers in defense of everything he believed. The news of Horus's betrayal reached us while we were conducting compliance operations in the Viridian system, Cassius recorded, his words still carrying the shock of that terrible revelation. Lord Guilliman's initial reaction was not anger, but disbelief. Not because he doubted the intelligence, but because he could not comprehend how a being he had loved as a brother could have fallen so far from honor. The strategic implications of the heresy were immediately apparent to Guilliman's analytical mind. The rebellion's scope and coordination indicated planning that had proceeded for years, while the loyal Primarchs remained oblivious to the growing conspiracy. Within hours of receiving the reports, Lord Guilliman had begun strategic assessments that chilled every officer who read them, Cassius noted. He calculated that the traitor forces controlled approximately 40% of the Astartes, commanded significant elements of the Imperial Navy, and had likely infiltrated other Imperial institutions to degrees that could not yet be determined. The psychological impact of the betrayal on the 13th Legion was profound. Warriors who had fought alongside the traitor legions during the Great Crusade struggled to reconcile their memories of brotherhood with the reality of civil war. I conducted hundreds of individual counseling sessions during those first months, Cassius recorded. Battle brothers who had served with distinction for decades questioned everything they believed about loyalty, honor, and the nature of their calling. Lord Guilliman's response was to address these doubts directly, rather than suppress them through discipline. Guilliman's approach to managing his legion's morale during the crisis reflected his understanding that spiritual strength was as important as tactical preparation. He encouraged open discussion of the theological and philosophical questions raised by the heresy, rather than demanding blind faith. Lord Guilliman established what he called truth circles, gatherings where warriors could express their doubts and fears without fear of punishment, Cassius observed. His participation in these discussions was remarkable. He shared his own struggles with understanding how beings created for nobility could choose corruption, demonstrating that even Primarchs were not immune to spiritual crisis. The military preparations for the coming conflict required innovations in doctrine and organization that reflected the unique challenges of fighting enemies who possessed intimate knowledge of Imperial tactics and capabilities. Traditional Astartes strategies had to be modified to account for opponents who understood them perfectly. Every tactical manual had to be reconsidered, Cassius noted. Standard operating procedures became predictable vulnerabilities when facing enemies who had helped develop them. Lord Guilliman spent weeks creating new tactical frameworks that maintained operational effectiveness while preventing exploitation by former allies. The isolation of the loyal forces became apparent as the scope of the rebellion expanded. Communication networks had been compromised, supply lines disrupted, and entire sectors cut off from central coordination. Each loyal legion found itself fighting alone against overwhelming odds. Reports from other legions painted an increasingly desperate picture, Cassius recorded. The Iron Hands had been decimated at Istvan V, the Imperial Fists were preparing for siege on Terra, and countless other loyal forces were scattered across the galaxy, fighting isolated actions against superior numbers. Guilliman's response to this strategic crisis was characteristic of his approach to complex problems. Rather than allowing despair to paralyze decision-making, he focused on what could be controlled and influenced, rather than lamenting what was beyond his power to change. Lord Guilliman gathered his senior staff and delivered what became known as the Practical Loyalty Address, Cassius noted. He acknowledged that the Imperium they had known was dying, but argued that this made their duty clearer rather than more complex. They would save what could be saved, build what needed to be built, and prepare for whatever emerged from the chaos. The Battle of Calth marked the 13th Legion's baptism of fire in the Civil War that would define their identity for millennia to come. The Word-Bearers' surprise attack revealed the depths of corruption that had taken hold in their former allies while testing every aspect of Guilliman's leadership. The treachery at Calth was total, Cassius recorded with barely controlled fury. Lorgar's sons struck without warning during what should have been a joint operation, using their knowledge of our procedures to maximize the devastation. Yet, even in that moment of betrayal, Lord Guilliman's first concern was for the civilians caught in the crossfire. The response to the Calth attack demonstrated both Guilliman's tactical genius and his moral consistency under extreme pressure. While organizing the military resistance that would eventually drive off the attackers, he simultaneously coordinated evacuation efforts and humanitarian relief operations. I watched Lord Guilliman command a three-dimensional battle that spanned an entire star system while never losing sight of his responsibility to protect non-combatants, Cassius observed. His ability to maintain strategic focus while attending to moral obligations was perhaps his greatest demonstration of leadership under fire. The aftermath of Calth required Guilliman to confront the personal cost of the heresy in ways that tested his emotional resilience as much as his intellectual capabilities. The loss of so many warriors who had served under him for decades created grief that threatened to overwhelm even his superhuman constitution. I found Lord Guilliman alone in the Chapel of Fallen Heroes, reading the names of every Ultramarine who had died in the attack, Cassius recorded. When I asked if he needed anything, he replied that he was trying to remember them as they had been rather than as they had died. The effort to maintain hope in the face of such loss was visible in every line of his face. The strategic doctrine that emerged from the Calth experience influenced Guilliman's approach to the remainder of the heresy. He recognized that victory would require not just military success, but the preservation of imperial institutions and values that could serve as foundations for post-war reconstruction. Lord Guilliman began developing what he called continuity protocols. plans for maintaining imperial governance even if Terra itself fell to the traitors, Cassius noted. He understood that winning the war would be meaningless if the victory left humanity with nothing worth governing. The final phase of Guilliman's heresy experience was marked by his growing realization that the conflict would leave scars that could never fully heal. The brotherhood of Primarchs had been shattered, the unity of the legions destroyed, and the optimism of the Great Crusade replaced by the grim necessity of survival. As reports arrived of the Emperor's confrontation with Horus, Lord Guilliman began planning for a future that none of them had anticipated, Cassius concluded. He understood that the Imperium that emerged from the heresy would need different institutions, different safeguards, and different philosophical foundations than the one that had entered it. His work on what would become the Codex Astartes had already begun, driven not by desire for glory, but by determination to ensure that such betrayal could never again threaten humanity's survival. Chapter 10. The Eternal Vigil. The final testimony in this collection comes from Chapter Master Calgar himself. Writing in the years following Guilliman's resurrection and return to active leadership of the Imperium. His perspective, spanning both the legend and the reality of the Primarch's service, provides a fitting conclusion to the story of the Avenging Son's rise to greatness. I have served the Ultramarines for over 4 centuries, Calgar wrote, his words carrying the authority of someone who had inherited both the burden and the privilege of Guilliman's legacy. During most of that time, our Primarch existed more as inspiration than as active leader, a figure preserved in stasis whose achievements provided guidance for our actions, but whose physical presence was beyond our reach. His return has allowed me to understand the difference between serving a legend and serving the man who created it. The millennia of Guilliman's absence had transformed him into something approaching myth within the 13th Legion and its successor chapters. His tactical doctrines were studied with religious devotion. His administrative innovations had become the foundation of imperial governance, and his moral example provided spiritual guidance for generations of warriors. We governed ourselves according to what we believed Lord Guilliman would have wanted, Calgar observed. Every decision was evaluated against the question of whether it honored his memory and advanced his vision for humanity's future. Yet none of us truly understood the weight of responsibility that had shaped his original choices. The process of Guilliman's resurrection and recovery revealed aspects of his character that had been obscured by legend. The Primarch who emerged from stasis was both the figure of memory and something more complex, a being who retained his essential nature while bearing the accumulated wisdom and pain of his experiences. Lord Guilliman's first words upon awakening were questions about the status of his sons and the condition of his realm, Calgar recorded. Before addressing his own needs, before asking about the circumstances of his revival, he sought to understand what had happened to those for whom he felt responsible. Even after 10,000 years in stasis, his first impulse was toward duty rather than self-concern. The adjustment to a galaxy transformed by millennia of decline and stagnation challenged even Guilliman's exceptional adaptability. The Imperium he had helped build had become something he barely recognized. More paranoid, more rigid, and far more willing to accept stagnation as the price of stability. I watched Lord Guilliman struggle to reconcile his memories of what the Imperium had been with the reality of what it had become, Calgar noted. His frustration was evident as he encountered institutions that had preserved the forms of his innovations while losing their essential spirit. Efficiency had become ritualized procedure. Adaptability had become dogmatic adherence to regulation. The strategic challenges facing the returned Primarch exceeded even those he had confronted during the heresy. The galaxy was literally split in half by the Great Rift. Billions of worlds were cut off from Terra's light, and threats that had been contained for millennia were breaking free across the Imperium's overstretched borders. Lord Guilliman's response to these overwhelming challenges was characteristic of his approach to complex problems, Calgar observed. He began with systematic analysis of available resources and immediate threats, then developed comprehensive plans that addressed both tactical necessities and strategic objectives. The Indomitus Crusade represented his attempt to stabilize the situation while building foundations for long-term recovery.